Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. I am your host, Roy Kessel, and today we are very excited to have with us Meredith Whitley. Meredith is an associate professor at Adelphi University, and she is also the editor of the Journal of Sport for Development and the coordinator of the Sports-Based Youth Development Program. So Meredith, we appreciate you taking the time to be here, and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk today.
We know you've got a lot going on with the teaching you do, the research, the journal. So we really want to dive into all of that. But I think in order to set the proper stage, it's useful for people to understand what got you interested in sports when you were young. What sports did you participate in, and what was your excitement?
Yeah, sure. So I think similar to many folks out there, I've been a lifelong athlete playing lots of different sports. Probably the sports that I was most involved with growing up, I was a gymnast for a long time. And then as I got into middle school and high school, the sports that I really narrowed in on were basketball and soccer. And then I also ran cross country, during my high school years. And then into college, I was able to play at the college level playing basketball, which was really nice. So yeah, I think just, my parents and my sister, we were all very active. They introduced me to a lot of different sports. And I got the most interested in those and had a range of really positive experiences and also had some maybe not so positive experiences that, I'll come back to later on and certainly have been some of the drivers of the research and teaching that I do now.
So where did you play basketball in college?
Yeah, I played at New York University, right in Manhattan.
All right. And when you were playing, I know you said you played basketball and soccer were the main sports you were playing. What attracted you to those sports, and ultimately what made you pick basketball as the sport that you pursued?
Sure. I think, certainly I enjoyed being active, working together as a team. Those are two sports where, working with your teammates, figuring out game plans, strategizing, working together are really key points, right, in order to be successful. And I really enjoyed that. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I navigated towards those particular sports. And I also just love to compete. I love to train. I love to try to get better and improve at those specific sports, but just in life in general. And so in terms of being an athlete, I really relish in that opportunity to work hard, to get feedback from my coaches, from my peers, and try to improve my sports skills each and every day. And then go on the field, right? Or go on the court and try those out and see where I was at against the competition, and what I could keep doing to get a little bit better each day. So I really like that. And that was a lot of fun. I think it was also a domain where, like, especially on the basketball court and on the soccer field, where I felt like I had some skill, right? I think something that, research has shown us is that all of us are motivated in environments where we feel confident, right? And so, for example, I am a horrible bowler, right? And I'm horrible at golf. Those are not sports that I'm going to think to go out and look forward and work on each and every day, because I don't feel that confident in those sports. I certainly, perhaps over time and with practice, could get there. But I think in basketball and soccer, I was introduced to those sports early on. I kept getting feedback and kept improving, and I felt confident in those sports. And so that made me enjoy those experiences even more. In terms of why I chose basketball over soccer, I think, some of it was, I think I had a little more skill in basketball than I did in soccer. And so I got a little more traction on the recruitment side in terms of, different colleges to consider, universities to consider playing at. And yeah, I mean, that's probably one of it. I still today am more of a soccer fan than a basketball fan. So I think perhaps the sport chose me a little bit more than I chose the sport.
It's always interesting when you talk to people about how they selected a sport, and obviously that competency and feeling of success is a positive reinforcement mechanism. You hear the discussion about the 10,000 hours to become competent. And one of the struggles that we see today is that specialization at an early age is really a struggle. And I know in the work that you've done on SBYD areas, that's something that you've looked at as well. And give people a little bit of a sense now, after you finished at NYU, what did you study there? And then what did you do after college?
Sure. So while I was at NYU, I was trying to figure out my career path. I think I switched my major once or twice. I ended up majoring in history and minoring in computer applications. So a little bit different of a path, but I think while I was there, I was playing basketball, but I was also taking part in a whole bunch of different sports experiences. I think I had 5 different sports related internships while I was there in different, parts of the sports industry. And so I had in my head, I was pretty sure I wanted to take that direction in the future, and was trying to figure out how to get there. And so right after I graduated, I worked as an assistant college basketball coach for a year, and really enjoyed that experience, learned a lot, and found that I really enjoyed working with college athletes and college students, and just that building relationships with them, mentoring them, supporting their development, in this case on the court, but also there's a lot of development in terms of, their lives, when they were doing what they wanted to pursue, or the careers they wanted to go into. And so that kind of stuck with me. And so I realized college coaching isn't quite it for me. The recruitment side, you have to be fully committed on the recruitment side. And that wasn't really my cup of tea and what I was interested in doing with most of my time. And so I ended up moving to Boston after that year, and just found out about this whole field of sports psychology, and got really interested in that. And so ended up getting my master's degree at Boston University. And it's a master's degree in counseling, but there's a specialization in sports psychology. And that was really the focus. And during that time, it was my first introduction to the field of sport for development, or sport-based youth development, depending on the terminology that you'd like to use. And so I started to have different experiences. I was working in a high school that had a sport-based youth development program integrated into the high school. And it just kind of opened up my eyes to that opportunity and those possibilities, not just working with college students, but also working with younger people, and the potential for sport to do more. And that led me to a PhD program at Michigan State. And that kind of combined my interests. That PhD program was in sports psychology. And so I continued to develop that skill set and learn about sports psychology in terms of working with athletes, working with coaches, working with teams on the mental side of the game. But I also continued to learn and study and do research on youth sport and sport-based youth development. There's an Institute for the Study of Youth Sports at Michigan State where I did my research and was part of that team. And I had, my mentor, Dr. Dan Gould, was there, and he has a really nice intersection between sports psychology and sport-based youth development, or in the sports psychology literature, they typically call it positive youth development through sport. And so I had a lot of wonderful experiences there, and doing programming, working with refugee children and youth, using sport for good, and getting some experiences in programming and research experiences in South Africa as well. And so learned a lot, and realized that as much as I love and relish the sports psychology field, really focusing on the potential for sport to help young people was really what I wanted to focus on.
So when you did the work with the refugee children in South Africa, tell us how that came about. I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. So it came about right before I started my PhD program at Michigan State. I was fortunate to go on a trip to South Africa with my mentor and advisor, Dr. Gould. And while we were there, I think that he saw my interactions with young people, and we were seeing different programs and being part of different experiences. And so when we got back to Michigan State and I started up my PhD, he, in his immortal wisdom, took me aside and said, we're going to keep, developing you as a teacher and as a researcher, but you need to find a way to get in the field, because I think that's, where your passion is right now. And I want to make sure you have that opportunity. And so I ended up finding out there was this wonderful refugee development center in downtown Lansing, and they were open to starting up a program, a sports program for the children and youth who were part of their overall programming. And so ended up over, I think, 2 or 3 years while I was at Michigan State, designing and implementing a weekly program. I think we had 2 programs typically each semester, and got to work with different undergraduate and graduate students and getting them involved in the programming as well, which is really exciting. So yeah, that's how that started up. And then in terms of South Africa, that initial trip just spawned some really interesting research collaboration ideas with some colleagues there in South Africa. And so the following summer, I returned, and we did a series of different research studies, just largely interviewing individuals who were involved in sports and using sport for good in one particular township in South Africa, as well as across the country, which is really exciting.
So most of the work when you were in South Africa then was in the townships, or what cities were you exploring?
Sure. While I was there, most of the work was in the Kayamandi Township, which is near Cape Town, and then also did, like I mentioned, some focus groups with coaches throughout the whole country. But yeah, most of the work was in the Kayamandi Township, and working in a particular community center in that township, and doing some different programming and training in partnership with that community center, as well as I sat down and spoke with young people who were involved in sports, coaches who were, involved in different programs and running their own sports programs within the Kayamandi Township, as well as parents and community members who were either involved or understanding the perceptions of their kids' experiences in these sports settings.
So you really had an opportunity to dive in deeply through those trips and seeing what goes on in the townships. Obviously, as you saw there, the country is very divided in terms of what goes on in Cape Town, the city, or Johannesburg, the city, versus what's going on in the townships that are just outside of those cities. As you look back now through the work you did with the refugees and the work that you did in South Africa, where did that lead you to in terms of the parts of the work that you're doing now?
Certainly. I think that those experiences really made me focus on the potential for sport to be a huge asset for young people who are growing up in under-resourced communities, who have experienced, significant traumas in their lifetime, who may be marginalized in different ways. And so I find that in almost all of my research and a lot of my teaching and work that I do with colleagues in the field, it's really focusing on how can we design and implement sports programs in ways that can do more for those who need it most.
And then when you talk about those that need it most, unfortunately, when we look around, that's a pretty large population. There's so many organizations that could really use this. There's so many youth, not only in the US, but across the globe, that don't have those opportunities. So when you were working at Michigan State and going through working at the Refugee Center and designing the research that you do now, maybe walk us through a little bit of the evolution of how you've kind of come through and in your role now, in addition to the teaching, I know you do a lot of work with the SBYD and with the journal. So tell us how those all interrelate now.
Sure. It's a very simple question.
You're limited to 2 hours here on this answer. So.
Right. No problem. I think 2 hours, any academic will tell you is not enough time, but
that's why we have so much passion. If it was enough time, right, then we wouldn't be doing this, because then you'd be on to the next thing. So we all know this could be a 2-week conversation.
Totally. No, I think that, one question, that's been driving a lot of my research is, like you said, is thinking about how more individuals who really need really meaningful support systems can access better sport programs that can be, that support for them, and helping them discover their paths in life and supporting them to pursue those paths. I think that one of the challenges that we find in the sport for development field is that there are some incredible programs, as you know, all around the world that are using sport to change kids' lives and trying to address these really complex, weighty issues, right? Thinking about homelessness, thinking about, extreme poverty, community violence, and different things like that. And so I think one of the challenges is to understand the role of these programs in the broader system. And I think that there is a huge potential, and we're seeing this happen in some of the research that's going on, some of mine as well as some of others, for these programs to be quite influential in the lives of young people. But it can be really hard to start to chip away at these really complex issues, right? I mean, if you're a single program operating on your own, trying to address homelessness or trying to address extreme poverty or hunger, how do you do that on your own? And so I think one of the things that I've been really focused on over the past few years is trying to take more of a systems approach to my thinking, to the research that I'm doing, not just focusing on individual programs, but maybe how they interact with the education system, how they interact with the government services that are being provided, different things like that, right? And so not expecting one single program or just sport on its own to be the end all and be all for what every young person needs and to solve these really intractable issues. But okay, how can we figure out the role that sport has and the role that sport for development programs have and the influence that they can have on kids' lives and within communities, but also how can they connect with other organizations and programs and services and other individuals trying to affect change, and so that they can do more. And so I think that's something that I've been focusing on a lot in my research and my teaching. And then separately, it's also thinking about, there's sport for development, or here in the US, we call them sport-based youth development programs, but those are often serving a small percentage of the young people that are out there. Like you said, right? There's many people who want to and need access to really great sport programs. And so I think the broader question is, if we think about youth sport in the United States, a huge percentage of kids are involved in school sports and after school programs and youth leagues, youth sport leagues, and things like that. So how can we start to change the youth sport culture and the norms in youth sport to be better designed so that kids can have more optimal experiences and better outcomes? Because I know I'm far from alone in having some negative experiences in sport. And some of our research has shown that, sport can be incredibly destructive if it's not designed really thoughtfully and really intentionally. And so I think along with focusing on these more nuanced sport for development programs, we also need to be looking at the broader youth sport system and how can we change it for the better.
I know you've raised that a couple times in terms of negative experiences, and we hear all of the stories about athletes being abused by coaches, about parents putting enormous amounts of pressure on kids from a young age. As you said, For a lot of people, it becomes an area where if they don't feel competent or they don't feel they're going to be successful at a very, very early age, they just quit. So talk a little bit about maybe if you're willing to share your experiences and how that's kind of directed and informed some of the research you're doing.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I can just think about times when I've had coaches who were less than positive, we'll say, in terms of supporting the athletes and supporting the team. And I think that those were really hard experiences, right? For someone who, for many kids, the sport, sports is this domain where you have fun. You feel like you're getting better. You're working on something. You're connecting with your teammates, and this is really wonderful, positive experience. And I've certainly had that many times. But then when you have an adult or you have a culture or a climate that isn't as supportive as it could be, it can be quite negative. It can be quite debilitating for that athlete or for the overall team. And so I've had those experiences. And, in some of the research, my colleague, Will Massey at Oregon State University, and I have been doing some research over quite a number of years now. And we've specifically been focusing on the influence of sport on those who've experienced traumatic events during their childhood, right? And also grew up in under-resourced communities in the United States. But in doing so, we tried to acknowledge in the interviews with former athletes and other interviews that we've done with a number of different people as part of this research that, sport isn't inherently good, right? It needs to be designed as such. It needs to be designed in really thoughtful, intentional ways. And so through that research, we found that, for a number of athletes, sport is incredibly transformative. And this is, not specifically sport for development programs, just experiencing school sport and being involved with different club sport teams and things like that growing up. And even at the college and for some, they played at the professional level in some of the major leagues in the US. And so they're talking about how sport transformed their lives, but for others, it was incredibly destructive, right? And so they were rewarded for violence in sport, right? That was something that was rewarded, or they were seen maybe by family members or significant others as a lottery ticket. They were maybe treated as a commodity rather than treated as a young person who needs to be supported and to kind of explore their potential paths in life. And I think that was really hard for a lot of people. And I think we even had one former athlete who described, still to this day, he views sport as a loaded gun. And it was so much of a negative experience for him. And he has tried to stay away from it since.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about it that way, because I think you used the phrase sports, it's not inherently good or bad. It needs to be designed to be positive. And what's interesting is I've always viewed it maybe a little differently, which is that the negative influences come from the outside, the sport in and of itself. I think that the elements that you were describing in terms of kids having fun and the camaraderie and teamwork really comes from the concept of play, and the fact that play is now taken out of so many of the sports at a very young age, where it becomes miniature professionalized sports and training, the number of days and the rigidity of the coaching and the structure and the drills, where the play element, right? I know just from coaching my son, the kids want to just scrimmage, right? They want to play games, and okay, they'll put up with a few drills here and there, but when they're little, they just want to play. And I think that's something that we lose. I remember as a young kid when I played soccer, starting at U8, which was very young then. At this point, I think my son started at 4. So the kids that are getting involved are playing from very young ages. But we used to have soccer, and we would have practice maybe once, twice a week, maybe. games once, twice a week. So maybe 2 or 3 times a week total. Parents weren't involved other than the parents coaching the team. But most days it was come home from school, grab a ball, go across to the field, see who shows up, make up rules, make up teams, create your own goals, and just play pickup games. And so the play element is really there. And so talk a little bit about what you've seen from your research in terms of how that structure and professionalism has impacted that enjoyment level.
Totally. I think that there is huge benefit to play, to unstructured time for kids to create their own rules, to figure out the games that they want to play, to have arguments and then not have an adult jump in and solve those arguments for them, right? But to have to navigate that themselves. And I think that's something that we've seen in, as you've mentioned, in the youth sport, quote unquote industry, right? Is that we've seen just youth sport become professionalized. It's kind of like you said, it's modeled after college and professional sports when it shouldn't be. And especially, you get down into younger and younger ages, and it really shouldn't be. I mean, I remember learning quite a few years ago, and it stuck with me, as I think I mentioned that I'm a huge soccer fan, and, looking at some of the best, football programs in Europe, where they're getting kids engaged in a programming very early on, right? But I remember reading some of those best programs, they, like you said, will only have practice a few times a week with the hope that kids will go home and they'll still want to play. They'll go and take a soccer ball and dribble down the street and, be creative and try to play with their friends or play on their own or create different games so that they have that interest and that it's more of an intrinsic motivation to go out and have fun and play and be creative. And so that's something that stuck with me. I think, one of the needs that we have, along with figuring out more opportunities for kids to play, to have unstructured play and less structure in terms of their sport experiences, especially early in life, is also just to have less structure around kids' time. You think about how many kids are overscheduled and running from X to Y to Z each and every day. And so, one thing I did want to mention in speaking with you today is that I'm going to work my way back into talking about this focus on time, is that, so I'm one of the members of the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition Science Board. And we are just finishing up a paper now where we're focused on re-envisioning post-pandemic youth sport and how youth sport could better meet young people's mental, emotional, and social needs. And so in this paper, we assess the state of youth sport before the pandemic and acknowledge, so much good that was happening, but also the concerns that we have, some of which are, the professionalization of youth sports, early specialization, so kids starting to play one sport and only one sport earlier and earlier. And then we also talk about some of the challenges that the pandemic has brought about, right? But one of the unexpected bright spots has been that suddenly kids have had a little more time. And that for, I think, the most innovative youth sport teams and sport for development programs has meant that they have more time to help kids process what's happening. There's been a lot more one-on-one sessions, small group sessions, team meetings, and things in the virtual environment largely. But instead of kids rushing from, this practice to this and get home to do your homework and all of these different things, the kids have had time to share what's going on and process and connect with others. And certainly there have been many instances, and I think more instances, where kids are less connected during the pandemic. But I think we've seen some really innovative programming that has taken advantage of that extra time. And so one of our recommendations after, post-pandemic and in terms of youth sport is how can we hold on to that and retain that extra time for kids to just have time to connect, to talk with their coaches, to build connections with their peers, to process what's happening, to play a game in the street, right? Or at the local park, and not have so much structure, especially from adults in their lives, telling them each and everything that they need to do and kind of navigating that themselves.
And I think that that's one of the big challenges that I see that's out there is people want to have it both ways, and it's very difficult to do that. So we want to have this elite sport development model. And we think that in order to do that, we need to take all of the kids and throw them into the elite sport development model and just see what works. But we're really losing a huge number of people as lifelong sports participants, lifelong activity levels. One of the comments that probably has hit me the most over these last few years was at the Project Play Summit in, I guess in 2019, where Tim Shriver from Special Olympics talked about the fact that sports is the only place where we judge the proficiency at like first and second grade levels and then tell people that they're not qualified to do that anymore. And you would never walk up to a young student and say, Meredith, you're just really not good with numbers, so we're going to stop teaching you math in first or second grade. And Roy, your reading skills are subpar, so just stop reading and we're going to send you in a different direction, right? We bring people up to a level of sort of core competence, right, in order to get through. But from sports, we're judging at a very early age and we're cutting people off. And if somebody deems in second grade that you are not going to be able to play high school sports, much less college, right, high school sports, then why bother? As opposed to the mindset, I'll call it, of the intramural participation sports, where I know lots of people that have played softball with me. I still play hockey, right? All these other sports for many years, played indoor soccer, that never ever played it growing up, right? They got involved at a much later age and they found enjoyment in participating. These were people who never have and still don't have what would be called good skills, right, for higher level participation, but they go out and play, just like you talked about bowling. It may not be something that you know you're going to be really good at, but you go out periodically and you'll bowl. How do we change that model and get away from the professionalism?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think that it's really hard because I know I've spoken with many parents who want to get away from that professionalism, right? But then it's a little bit of the keeping up with the Joneses, where they're a little bit worried that, okay, I don't want my child to focus on one specific sport or to play, this much of a single sport this early. But if I don't, then will they be able to continue playing maybe one season a year until they're 10, until they're 12, 13, even later, all the way through high school, and then choose when they'd like to specialize. And there's a possibility that if you don't have that year-round training, that maybe that isn't an option for that young person later down the line. So, I very much empathize with parents who are in this situation and with kids, with young athletes who are in this situation, trying to decide the best path for them when they may have interest, and many do, I did, in playing a variety of sports throughout their childhood, and ideally continuing to play a variety of sports through adolescence and into adulthood. I think one of the things that stuck with me the most, and this brings us back to more so systems thinking, which I referenced earlier, is that you need to think about how do we shift that system so that parents or kids aren't forced to make that choice, but the system hopefully is changed to be more conducive and more supportive of having, a variety of sport experiences, of not having to specialize ideally ever, but if you do, then it's much later along the lines, right? And so you're not choosing at 6 or 7 or 10 what sport that you're the best at, quote unquote, when you haven't even your body still has to change quite a bit, and you're going to have a lot is going to look different over the next few years. I think something that stuck with me is when during my time in South Africa was realizing that in their schools, if there were enough students who are interested in playing rugby or netball or the soccer or football, as they called it, to field 13 teams, they would field those teams. And that was the same all the way up through the university. They would field that many teams. And not only would they, have practices, and maybe it looks a little bit similar, like you said, to intramurals, but they would also have competitions. They would have support and jerseys from the university or from the school. And so it was this really wonderful opportunity for all to participate who wanted to. And they would, on school announcements, I remember being in the schools, and they would announce the results of the previous day's games and for all of the teams that competed. So there wasn't this perception of, well, only that first team is the team that we truly value, but all kids and their experiences were being valued and honored throughout the school, which I thought was pretty novel, and something that I think we could learn a lot from here in the US, to stop considering sport as something that is only an option, especially the further along you get and the older you get, for those who have a certain skill level, right? Because that's incredibly exclusionary. And if we're concerned with the obesity rates and the overall health of not just kids, but adults in our country, we need to get kids to have really positive, enjoyable sports experiences as they grow up, and then give them options to continue to engage in early adulthood and beyond.
Yeah, and I think that you talk about the obesity, you talk about the level of activity as adults, and how few people really participate in sports on an ongoing basis after youth sports, right? The data showing that by a young age, right, whether it's 12, 13, such a high percentage have quit, and many never really truly come back to that environment, unless it's much more in the mode of exercise just to stay healthy, in terms of being on a treadmill or an elliptical to keep themselves right, to do some cardio. But that element of play then is still missing. The element of teamwork and camaraderie is often still missing. And so you've talked a lot about that, and I know you've got your academic program in the SBYD that you wanted to talk about, and the fellowship opportunity.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it comes back to, like, you're highlighting, so many of us as we get older, our greatest connection to sport or physical activity is getting on a treadmill or an elliptical, or things like that. And I think that takes away, some of the greatest parts of sport are competing in a healthy way, right? But healthy competition, you want, that is a driver, and it gets you excited. And the same with talent development. I mean, I miss having a coach give me feedback or working on a specific skill, and I get a workout in, but I'm also, fully engaged in that activity and trying to learn and improve, and that's enjoyable. And so I think that, if there's ways that we can, not just at the, for kids and for young people, but if there's ways that we can make team sports and individual sports more accessible and more enjoyable for a larger number of people, the better it is. Right now, it's just hard and it's expensive. So yeah, that's something that I keep in mind. But yeah, I did want to talk a little bit about one of my roles and in my professional life is, so I'm, like you mentioned at the beginning, I'm an associate professor at Adelphi, and we have a graduate program that is focused on this area. It's focused on sport-based youth development. And so we have graduate students who are learning many of these same concepts and ideas that we've been talking about today, in terms of how do you design and implement sport programs so that they can be more inclusive, so that they can be more positive, so that they can have not just better outcomes for young people, but lifelong outcomes for young people. And so we have students who are learning that in the classroom with us. and then going and pursuing that as careers, as coaches, as program managers, as administrators. They're working in the corporate social responsibility space. They're working in, you know, many different careers that are connected to using sport for good, which is pretty exciting. And one opportunity that I just wanted to share, we've had a really innovative partnership with sport for development programs throughout New York City over the past, I think we're entering our 5th or 6th year now, where students can apply for a sport-based youth development fellowship. And if they're selected, then they work part-time with a program in and around New York City. And in exchange, that program pays for their tuition over 2 years. And so it's been a pretty awesome partnership that we've had with different organizations, and it's enabled just this wonderful group of students come in each year as part of this, and they're learning from day one in the field about how to use sport for good, and they're also learning in the classroom. And so it's been a really exciting partnership, and something that we're currently recruiting. If anyone's interested, you know, feel free to reach out to me, but something that I'm hoping we can continue for the foreseeable future, because it's had a lot of success.
Well, Meredith, I know we're up against the clock here. We've got so much more that we want to talk about. We're going to have to drag you back on for another episode here to continue this, because your work is just fascinating and so important for people to understand more about it. So we want to thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I enjoy the conversation and am really excited to share some of these topics and see where the conversation goes in the future.
Well, we will look forward to having you back. So congratulations on the outstanding work, and we encourage you to let us know how we can help. And to all our viewers and listeners, we appreciate you taking time to join us for the Sports Philanthropy podcast. This is your host, Roy Kessel, signing off. Please don't forget to live generously.